Yeah, my name is Jason Miller. I'm a career flight instructor. I've been teaching flying since 2002, primarily in the San Francisco Bay Area. I focus on technically advanced aircraft and instrument flying, really.
I heard about, or I saw your email blast about how there was an accident or airplane lost an engine. That sucks.
Yeah, man, it was, we've been doing those trips since 2011.
Yeah.
Like 3 trips a year, essentially. And knock on wood, we've been very lucky. And then this year, heading home, it happens. The interesting part is the education that we teach out there is designed to make a situation like that survivable, efficient. We have, and it's not just me, it's like Peter Lert. We bring in, he's a former Burt Rutan test pilot. He talks about how to disperse energy in your crash. And Howard talks about, staying found, making sure you have the right PLB, that you have messaging equipment. I mean, the whole education we teach is about that event. So it was really validating.
They're like, oh shoot, we got to remember everything we just learned today.
Yeah, well, it's like with anything in flying, it's like when it's a drill until you have to use it, right? Like Sully only ever did that in a sim until the day it happened in the plane, and that's kind of what happened to us. And these guys did an amazing job, and we validated everything we teach out there. And yeah, for me, it was a personal wake up call.
Yeah.
Like, for example, I'll be honest, I don't fly all the time with a vest on with all my survival gear on it. I don't, even though I listen to Eric Cope, our senior instructor, tell me and tell the whole crew that that's what you have to do, and watching this happen.
Anytime you're flying, you should have a vest on with all your survival gear.
Eric does. So like Eric Cope is a former airline pilot, former L-1011 captain, DC-8 captain. He flew helicopters in the Army. He flew helicopters for timber companies. He owns a 180. He has a house in Idaho. He told me he can't start his 180 until the vest is zipped up. And it's his Army issue vest that he's been wearing since he was in the Army.
Now, do you think he would do the same thing if he lived in New York City and he was flying in very populous areas? Or do you think it's mostly like Idaho? You go down, there's no guarantee you're going to be found in 24 hours.
Right. It's definitely not true in New York City, right? So the thing we have to do then is decide when is it appropriate and sort of develop an SOP around it. And I'll give you an example. Like a week after this thing happened, I'm out here flying in Nevada County, which is pretty rural. There's 12,000 people in the town over here, 2,500 people in the town over there. We're backed up against the Tahoe National Forest. And I fly with a guy in a Mooney. He's got another flight instructor. So I go out with him on this particular Thursday, and he tells me that his other instructor soloed him. And I was like, great. I'm like, you've been flying solo? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, where you been going? He's like, oh, just all around. And you look out and around, and there's nothing but pine trees in every direction that you can see, And so I say, well, do you have a personal locator beacon? And he was like, no. Just never even thought of it, right? So here's a student leaving his home base, just going 3 or 4 miles away. Mm-hmm. But if we don't know which direction he's going, he's likely not ever going to be found, right? Yeah. So the risk for him, as opposed to somebody in New York City where it's like, yeah, no, it doesn't matter. In New York City, you don't need your survival knife on your body. But you get real rural real fast before you know it. Like it's not, and you could say the same thing about parts of Ohio,
North Carolina,
all over the place.
Yeah. I mean, I never really, especially when you're a student pilot, you don't think about that. You're just like really like, man, I'm so glad I remember how to fly an airplane and land and talk at the same time. It's like you're not thinking about the idea of this happening to you so far away because you're just focused on so many other things and not focused on what happens if this happens. And
it's true.
What's crazy is it can you have an equal chance of it happening on hour 1 as you do hour 10,000. So you never know when the emergency is going to come. And there are stories of people on their solos losing engines or people on their first flight losing engines. It's anytime you start that engine, there's a chance it could go out. It's a lot of moving pieces in there, right?
Yeah, 100%. And it's like anytime I can identify what I call the ostrich approach to risk management, where it's just like people just don't think about it. They just don't think about it. An example might be you could tell a pilot, hey, would you go fly 6 miles offshore here at 1,000 feet in a single engine airplane on a beautiful VFR day? And they'd be like, heck no, I would never do that. That's crazy. If you lose your engine, you go in the water. Okay, then 2 weeks later, when the fog rolls in, they're flying the ILS into Monterey and they're 5 miles offshore at 1,500 feet, just not thinking about it, right? It's just the ostrich approach. Like if I can't see the water, that risk no longer exists. It's just invisible.
I was doing aerial survey, and this is one of the few planes that were IFR certified, and we're down in Galveston, and we're landing, I can't remember the runway configuration, but we're landing either north, northeast, whatever it was, where the ILS is over the water. And that thought crossed my mind. I was like, it was like marginal VFR. It's like, we could kind of get down, it's like, how comfortable do I feel going that far out over the water in Houston, Texas, or Galveston, Texas, or just anywhere? It's like, you got to think about that sometimes.
Yeah, you do. And to be fair, my mentor, Richard, was the one who first sort of mentioned it to me. And I think that's all we're really trying to do is get pilots to get their heads out of the sand and just consider these risks. If you want to accept them, that's fine. But I remember starting instrument training with Richard. This is back in 1998, I think, something like that. And
don't date yourself.
To him, and I said to him, hey, let's fly the ILS, whatever, the runway 9 approach or whatever it was into Monterey. And he said, I'm not doing that. And I was like, and I literally didn't know. I was like, why wouldn't you do that? He's like, do you see that? He's like, that's 4.5 miles offshore and you're at 1,300 feet. He's like, would you do that VFR? Maybe if you're a Gulfstream, fly that approach, but not for me and my 172, So I mean, we have to really consider like what risks we're taking on. And I think, like, to your point, it's a bit of a finer art. In the beginning, you're just overwhelmed. Yeah. And then as you get comfortable, I mean, here I am after 2 decades of experience, really starting to take some of the things that even we've been teaching more seriously.
Yeah. And I was thinking about Monterey with my previous job. I went to Monterey quite a bit, and I don't think I've ever landed on 9 in Monterey. I think it's always been the other runways. And there's been the weather's beautiful there until it's not, right? And then it's pretty bad. And we've had some storms where we can't get in and go around, and the rain just sits there. The clouds get low. So Monterey, man, I love the area. Having overnights in Monterey is amazing.
It's beautiful, but there's terrain there too. I mean, they've had a number of accidents. People vectored into the mountain back before radar was really good.
Yeah, thank goodness for radar.
Right, and terrain features on your iPad.
But I know, right? And Garmin Pilot, thank goodness.
And Garmin Pilot, right?
Amazing, so we were previously talking about kind of our series that we're doing, and I figured we could just continue on. We stopped the private pilot. I figured we just go straight into instrument pilot, and that kind of kicks into releases with your app as well. So we'll plug that. I might just include everything we just talked about, because I feel like we just kind of hit the ground running. And we'll just
go ahead. I kind of figured we were recording.
Always recording, man. Always recording. So if you're listening now, this is technically the beginning of the podcast, but you got an extra 8 minutes of just what normally happens when Jason and I talk. It's just always that. Like, it's just always a podcast. We can always record it, and it can be something useful, right?
That's right. And we should. Cool. Maybe we don't always, but we always should.
24/7 streaming podcast with Jason.
It'd be like
a terrible idea. Oh my God. Yeah, right. Truman Show. Oh, that would not be ideal. But anyways, let's do a quick intro about yourself, and then we'll get started. I'm trying to think of the movie where they uploaded like consciousness into AI, and it's like what you're doing for your app. It's just Jason's consciousness right there.
Yeah, it's funny. It's we've actually looked at that. We've been talking to some AI people. I don't want to derail this conversation, but it's hard to see exactly where that's going right now.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like every company is trying to implement AI in some way. So it'll be interesting to see how it pans out in applications in aviation, whether we're talking about Garmin Pilot or whatever you use. There could be some help with AI with planning flights or doing other stuff, but legality of stuff, it's like, well, don't trust the computer. There's a mess in there, right? But AI is definitely going to come and be a bigger part of what we do. So something just to keep an eye on.
Yeah, for sure it will. And what's funny is though, like, I really find often what I end up saying to my team, and I'm really blessed at this point to have a team of about 12 people helping build ground school. But I always tell them that I think nobody's really done the basics well. So like, it's like whenever there's a lot of fancy new things, at least in flight training, like if someone tells me, they can create an AI flight instructor, they can build this tool that does this thing and shows you the data, and you're 6.7 centimeters off your center line on every 1.4 G landing, and all this stuff is like, I think we can just go back to basics. I don't believe that for the last 120 years, we've really done a great job of teaching the basics. And so a lot of the tools that we've built into the app are not really fancy per se, but they are just valuable in teaching the basics. You know, a quick example is we've built this tap target thing where we show video from the cockpit, from the pilot's view, and we ask people to touch the screen where they see things and when they see things, and we can tell them where they should be looking. You know, these are very old. This is what Richard taught me. This is just old school stuff. It's not a fancy piece of data or anything. It's just a way to evaluate, are we teaching you valuable things? Are you learning them? And can you apply them in the airplane? There's a lot of that in the app.
Yeah. And that's something that it's hard to teach, right? It's something that you got to kind of pick up on your own. And when someone's sitting next to you just saying, all right, look there. And you're like, where? Where? If you have like an actual guideline of like, all right, tap here, that's where you should look. That's what the site picture should look.
Yeah, that. And when I teach, I, of course, always fly with a heads-up display.
Yeah.
So, you know, expo market. So my students all have a heads-up display. We just write on the window where you're supposed to look.
Oh, that's
but
cool.
Yeah, but with the technology in the app, you know, we can show them that and then ask them to prove it, you know.
So what else is going on with the app? Recently, I know you're more focused. You had private pilot, now you have instrument rating. How's everything been going with that?
It's been going great. You know, I think maybe I'm not the world's best businessman. We're leaving money on the table. It's all one price, but there's a reason for that, and I'm excited about where we're headed with it. So the exciting part for users now is they get everything in the app, the private course, the instrument course, and I think like some of the challenges for us is to help experienced pilots understand that there's valuable content deep in there that they might not know about. And so we're building this, like I said, mastering IFR course and mastering landings course. And the nice thing about being one price is we can just add all this stuff to the app, and it's just a more compelling reason why somebody should own it and engage with it.
Yeah. And
but I'm really,
keep going.
Well, I was just gonna say, I'm really fortunate, like I said a minute ago, to be surrounded by such incredible people. You know, we're all committed to making what we believe is the best flight training product ever. And that's like what we're focused on. Yeah. And it's inspiring. You know, a lot of the guys are just brilliant. One of them's a UPS pilot. One's a prime pilot. They're all active flight instructors, former military guys. I just feel really lucky to be working with the guys I'm working with and girls and building what we're building.
I love it. I really do. And I'm getting ready to start renting a Bonanza at a local flying club. And I was just like, some of the concepts of flying a small plane are so far removed from my brain with my training, with all my 121, AQP. I mean, obviously they're still there, right? Once I get into it, it's going to take like an hour or two and everything should come back. But I was just playing through the ground school app as well and just like clicking buttons like, all right, let me try to remember tomato flames, or let me try to remember like this, like just the basic stuff, just so I can kind of have an idea, because it's a total different world. You as an airline pilot can find yourself in a lot of trouble. We're not necessarily flying just regulation wise, because when you go to the airplane, you know, you look for the maintenance book, you sign off on stuff, and there's a lot of people doing other jobs, where when you're flying your small plane, it's pretty much you doing your job. If you're running from a flying club, you got to make sure other people did their job too. So a lot more to kind of take into consideration.
Yeah. And that's, you know, that's a good example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, because I really believe in ritualization, you know, of the flying. And I know in your professional life, there's a lot of that, right? Like when you get into when you go up on the flight deck and you are flying with a captain you've never met at the airlines, both of you are sort of involved in executing a ritual that you have both rehearsed independently, but now you're doing it together. It'd be like if you knew your part in a play and the captain knew their part in the play, even though you guys have never performed it together, you could theoretically jump on stage and just start executing the play. You know, that's how the pros work. And I'm a big believer in that at all levels, you know, even at the private level. So we teach it that way. I teach it that way to normal living 3-dimensional students, and we teach it that way in our app. But I also think that's a huge bit of of gold. So when people say to me like, oh, I don't need your app, I already did my ground school, or I already passed my written, I'm like, well, wait a minute, you know, check it out. There's a free trial. You can go into the flight side, look for these little gold nuggets that maybe your instructor didn't teach you that way. And to make it easier for people, that's the kind of stuff we're going to bring forward and just make like a mini course for anybody that has never seen a full set of single pilot SOPs, you know, and they're not mine. I mean, I took these SOPs from professional single pilot operators over the years, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, they're mine as much as they're anybody's.
But it's one place for everyone to kind of find it out, which is really cool. But what we are here today to, one, talk about the app, obviously, because it's great, fantastic. And then, like you said, it's your baby. But number two, continue the series of, no, great. I love learning more about it. Continue the series of how to become a, pilot. We did student pilot, we did private pilot, instrument pilot, and who knows how long we'll go on for this. Maybe we'll do like space rocket pilot if we can get someone qualified to talk about that. But in your mind, I'll start it off with this. What makes a good instrument student? We talked about private students. We talked about before you become a private, all the work you need to do. But when you get to instrument, it's a different language. Everything you learned is going to be so different than what you're about to do and so foreign. How much pre-work should someone do? Like, should someone complete a full course before they even go for their instrument flying? Learn on the fly? Just kind of talk about what I should do before I even start flying instrument.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I think because it's your second thing potentially, or at least you've done a certificate already, it makes more sense with the instruments to go through the written before you get started. With the private, if you're brand new to flight training and you do it that way, you're easily overwhelmed, or you're going to read things that just don't make sense. PAPI, you read about PAPI 3 months ago, but then you're out there in the field and your instructor says, hey, there's a PAPI. You're like, what the heck was that thing I read about? You don't remember. But now that you know what becoming a pilot is like, going into the instrument rating, you really should get a lot of that ground knowledge out of the way, because you don't want to be worrying about things like chart symbology or what is an MEA or what is a MOCA or an AROCA. You want all that knowledge in place, because flying instruments is more advanced, it's more complex, and it's straight up harder. So that basic knowledge you just kind of need to have in place. And I always say to new instrument students, flying instruments is like doing something you've always done and that you know how to do well, like riding a bike, for example. Only now you're blindfolded and you have a little elf on your shoulder telling you what's happening. Here comes a turn, here comes a turn, here comes a turn. Okay, lean, stop your turn, and every bit of information you're getting is by definition old. It's just slightly old. Doesn't have to be that old. Here comes the turn now. I turn. It's like, that's how instrument flying works. So getting comfortable with that. And there's an analogy in instrument flying too. And I always put these pictures that I'm giving you here and the listeners, I always put these pictures in people's minds. The other one I do is, like, imagine you have an office floor, like a whole office floor where you've got different rooms. And I always imagine something circular, like a circular tower with a hallway that goes around the outside. And there's all these conference rooms, let's say 6 conference rooms, and you're the boss. And your job is to make sure that all 6 teams in those conference rooms finish at exactly the same time in 30 minutes. So you have to run into one room and say, how you guys doing? You're doing good. Okay, everything's fine. Okay, I'll be right back. You run into the next room, like, how you guys doing? Okay, everything's good. I'll be right back. You run into the third room and they're like, sir, we got a problem. There's no way we can handle this. You're like, okay, good. Hold on a minute. I'll be right back. And you figure out how you're going to work that problem, but you can't go into that problem and stay there till 6 without going into the other rooms. You can't just say, okay, you got a problem. Let's roll up our sleeves and let's spend the next 30 minutes finishing this, because there's other rooms happening, right? So flying instruments is a little bit like that. There's flying the airplane, there's programming the radios, there's navigating, there's communicating with air traffic control, there's briefing what you're going to do when you get there. There are a lot of different things that have to be done at once. But because nothing can be done at once, it's a lot of checking in with little things. And if you find yourself deep in a problem, it's a red flag. Like, lift your head up and figure out, what are you missing? Like, you're stuck in a room right now, and maybe you do have a problem. But if you don't pick your head up and come out of that room, other problems are going to happen and the whole thing is going to go off the rails, right? So that picture, I think, is important also. And then the last one I'll give you for instrument flying is the juggler. That there is I call it a physiological reaction, but everybody has it, myself included, everybody. The saturation point where you can't think anymore. And you can tell when a student's there, because you could say, like, what's your name? And they'll say standby. They literally can't even hear what's your name. They can't process the question. They can't answer Jason. So they say standby. That person is saturated. The good news is the saturation point is like a muscle. And the image that we paint for it is, like a juggler juggling balls, juggling one ball. You throw them another ball, 3 balls, or 2 balls, 3 balls, 4 balls, 5 balls. 6 balls, they're really good. Eventually, there's going to come a ball where they can't catch it. And when they can't catch it, they don't just miss that one. The whole house of cards comes down. And that's what happens at the saturation point. And so as a CFI, if you're aware of that, and you have to make your student aware of it, like if you work with it is what I'm saying, is like you push your student to the saturation point, you push them right there and then you dial it back, push them right there and dial it back. Autopilot is a great example. Let's say you're pushing a student and they're hand flying and they're this, that, or whatever, and you see that they're at the saturation point. Okay, take control of the airplane and engage the autopilot. Dial it back one notch. Same situation, but you just took the room called flying the airplane and you put a manager in there. Like that's fixed now. But what instrument candidates or applicants or people working on their instrument rating will realize, and what CFIs who don't already understand this will realize, is that the saturation point is a muscle. Like it is, you'll notice that it's like maxing in weight. You can, what saturated you 2 months ago is no longer saturating you. And you are now able to handle that much more and that much more and that much more. And, it's not just flying. I'm sure this goes on in life. I mean, I've heard people say, like, can you imagine somebody, just think of any billionaire person you can think of, like an Elon Musk or something, how much he has to do in a day versus how much I have to do in a day. He wasn't born that way. That's like the saturation muscle. That's just getting better and better and better and better and better until you're like what Jeff Bezos has 1.9 million employees or something. It's like
it's crazy.
Yeah. And so flying on instruments is like that. You can get really good.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I'm just thinking back when you were saying all this stuff, I was thinking about my experience with instrument flying, and there's definitely a moment, and you really have to count on your instructor to kind of, I think it's best for your instructor to ease you into it, right? Not just throw you to the wolves, because then you're just like, all right, screw that. I'm not doing that. But figuring out where your saturation point is and your breaking point of where you just shut down. And like you said, like the house falls down, it crumbles. Like you can't do simple math. You can't turn, you can't stay like you're just done. Until we can figure out, all right, what do we need to do? Just fly the airplane, and then we'll focus on that and then go from there. Which, by the way, is the most important thing for you to ever do, is just make sure you're always flying the airplane. You can worry about headings, just fly the airplane. But
it's the breathing part of living.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, maybe breathe through that helps as well. But there's definitely a breaking point for everyone. And it happened just because, you and your buddies started at the same time, just because they can do more than you at a certain point doesn't mean that you're a bad pilot, doesn't mean that you can't get it. There's this point in instrument flying, which I can't really explain why, but it's essentially you're just hitting your head against the wall until you break through. That's going to happen at someone for 20 hours of instrument flying. It's going to happen for 40 hours for someone. It's just however your brain can kind of conceptualize and put the big picture together. It was all steps for me. It was learning, like you said, like the verbiage, learning what everything meant on the charts, learning how to talk on the radio. And then toward the end, it was learning how to put everything together and be like, all right, this is why I'm holding. This is why I'm turning this one, listening to two planes ahead of you or the plane ahead of you. Be like, all right, well, they're getting vectored onto the approach. I can expect this vector as well. Or they're holding, so I can expect this hold. Kind of understanding the why behind instrument flying and the why the controllers are doing what they're doing. So it's definitely going to take steps. It's definitely going to take time, and eventually you're going to break through. It might take you a while. That's fine. There are plenty of people that I know that it probably took them a long time, and they're flying for the airlines. So you're good, man. You're good, or girl, whatever.
Yeah, you will get there. I like, this is like, I have, how do I say this? My instrument program is, I believe, radically different from all others. And I realized, like, the way you described it, by the way, and I think you're absolutely right, that as you go through, you get the finer points, the kind of awareness of the whys, right? The context and all that. But the way you described the training is the way most people do it, right? Where you like, okay, you learn to fly the plane, then you learn to work the radios, then you learn to fly the courses, then you learn to fly the ILS. I don't do it that way. So we don't do it that way. And in the ground school app, if you go to the instrument course, you'll see the way we do it. And I think, for example, so what I do is I use what I call template flights. And so if you and I were working on your instrument rating, the first template flight might be San Carlos to Stockton, specifically along airways. So we will request the airways. So we'll go San Carlos, radar vectors, Oakland, Victor 6, Altam intersection, then direct, maybe, who knows? Right? I don't know if that's the exact right route, something like that. we're going to fly that flight on your very first day when you come as your intro flight. We're going to fly it in the system with all equipment working, autopilot on, and just so you can see the context of everything, getting a clearance, waiting for release, taking off, seeing the whole thing point to point. That'd be the first time we fly the template flight. Then we might take 2 or 3 days to go out and build some skills. Okay, you're going to have to learn how to fly the plane. You're going to have to learn how to navigate the radios and all these things. But then before too many days, we go back to that very first flight, only now you're flying it maybe, and I'm flying still autopilot, still everything. And we plug the skills back into that same flight, and we'll keep revisiting that, just that one flight, until you can understand what it feels like in your body to be ahead of the airplane, to be thinking and talking ahead of the airplane, right? And only then will we take what we've learned and move it to template flight 2. Okay, now let's see what this looks like if it ends at a non-precision approach, and or a non-towered airport or something like that. And in the course of training, there'll be 3, maybe 4 template flights until we start getting really advanced, and then we're going, all over.
You're still, in a way, you're still easing them into it though, right? Like you're showing them the big picture, but you are maybe you'll do the radios, or maybe they'll fly, but each time you're kind of adding another skill in there, which essentially is still easing them in. And I think that's, like we both talked about, is you can't just really, you can throw them to the fire, and that some people might figure it out, but it's definitely a good way to ease them in like that and take some of the burden off of their hands, so they can just focus on the flying or the learning. So you're still doing that in a way for that, which I really like. If I was a CFI, that idea sounds great to me, because it is funny how if you just as simple as changing the flight plan, or as simple as changing an ILS to an RNAV or a VOR approach, like just that one change can mess you up for the whole flight, right? Like you could take off, everything go fine. You're like, all right, well, we're going to do the approach you've never done before and probably haven't looked at in a while, other than I told you to look at all the approaches last night, but you're now going to do the VOR. And I'm going to be like, what? And then you're just going to think about the VOR. You're going to miss calls. You're going to do just sloppiness, right? So I think that's definitely the way to do it.
Yeah, 100%. And it's maybe a subtle distinction, because like you said, you're still easing them in. But what we're doing is putting the primary instructional focus on the ability to think and talk in front of the airplane. For example, what I want more than the student understanding the differences between an ILS and a VOR, that's less important to me than the student realizing they're getting a little stressed. They need to slow the airplane down, and they're able to say, okay, when I get to LTAM intersection, it's going to be a right turn to a heading of 040. I'm going to switch my GPS to the navigational signal I want. I verified that. I identified it. My flow checks and checklists are done for right now. I have no time to start, and I'll report reaching. Okay, when I get there, I will. So their ability to recognize the big picture, create the time they need to push their mind out in front of the airplane and verbalize it, is way more important to me as a fundamental skill. Like I always say to students, I'm not worried that you're going to be able to hold altitude, hold needles, hold headings, fly approaches. Zero concern. I have zero concern that by the end of this instrument rating, you'll be able to do that. What I'm more concerned about is that you're going to be the kind of pilot who understands the big picture and can think and talk in front of the airplane, and that has a ritualized procedure based on decades of professional experience that you're going to use to fly this like you're the chief pilot of your own flight op, like you would hire yourself to fly your kids, to be like a real, like 1%er in it. And so it's subtle. It's like all the things you said, you are easing them in, but you're orienting it around these scenarios to how did it feel? Were you able to talk in front of the plane? Were you able to do all your checklists? Were you able to all those things? And there's to your point, there's enough variables in the same flight over and over again for people mostly not to get bored. ATC will try to vector you, or they'll have to give you delay things, or maybe a hold, or like things will come up. But it's not like what you said, if you switch the approach, this is when I noticed it when I was going through instrument rating or instrument training, was that like, for me, it was more like my instructor would say, okay, last week we went to Napa, we did the localizer. This week, let's go over here to NOS, and I'm going to show you an LNAV approach. And then next time, okay, well, we did those two already. So let's go to Santa Rosa. I want you to see an ILS, right? There was a lot of that. And it's like, if you do that, like you said, there's so many changes going from ILS to VOR that the 100% of the students' learning energy and all of it will be put into the details. What's different about this? Okay, this has this approach, or what does this mean? The timing thing has absolutely nothing to do with those core fundamental skills of staying in front of the airplane that I was talking about, and having like a ritualized procedure for checklists and all the things that at the end of the day, I believe are going to keep you safe. You know, we can argue about the, I mean, not argue, but we could, not you and I mean, the student and I, we could talk about the differences between different approaches, like, you know, till we're blue in the face. That's why I always say to the students, it's like, I'm not worried about that stuff. Like at the end of the day, we're going to run through so many different approaches. We're going to have so many little mini oral sessions and phase checks. Like there's no way you're going to get through this without being able to hold altitude and fly approaches. You know,
so in the airline world and, you know, bigger jet world, what's very important in any approach and what's being taught, what has been taught is being stabilized. Having criteria where you're stabilized at a certain spot, whether it's 500 feet, 1,000 feet, you need to be in certain parameters. Now, smaller airplanes, you don't have someone to tell on you. You don't have a chief pilot looking over you. So it's a lot of the honor system when you're flying 172s, when you're flying smaller bonanzas or whatever it is you're flying. How important do you, or how much emphasis do you put on stabilized approaches in instrument? Because like you said, there's a lot going on right now. You might be getting all these might be getting all these instructions, and all of a sudden you find yourself at the final approach fix, and maybe you haven't put your gear down, or you're not fully configured, or you're going 15 knots fast. How, like, is that something you're constantly thinking about in this world? I know smaller airplanes have the assumption that they can be more forgiving, which, I mean, obviously you're not going to stop in 6,000 feet or 3,000 feet like these bigger jets, but there is danger, especially when you get into Moonies that just don't want to stop flying, that you overrun runways, that you have incursions. And when something bad happens, you want everything going in your favor. So stabilization is amazing and is huge, but I kind of long worded that question, but how important is stabilization for you when you're teaching IFR?
It's certainly not as important as it is in flying heavy jets, you know, and I always want to use a little bit of caution when we, like, I think, for example, how checklists are used is an example of how we've really misunderstood two crew versus single pilot environments, right? We don't use I do, but in general, in GA, pilots are teaching checklist usage as though there are two pilots there. Whereas if you go get hired by Pac Valley or Ameriflight, or I don't know if Ameriflight does single pilot anymore, but you get hired by somebody that does single pilot, it's all about flow checks and acronyms, and then pick up the checklist because there's no pilot monitoring, right? So we have to be careful when we take crew or heavy transport category procedures and bring them down into GA. A lot of times it's fantastic, but we do have to use caution. So with stabilization, for example, being stabilized is just more critical for an aircraft with a lower thrust to weight ratio. You know, like I can arrest 1,000 foot per minute descent in about 3 seconds in a Cessna. You know, that's just a reality. That's just a truth. But if you're coming down in a big heavy jet at 1,000 feet per minute, you're not going to stop that in 3 seconds, right? It's going to be 6 or 7 seconds before power even hits the engines. So you're just in a situation where stabilization in the ways you're talking about it matters more. For example, this comes up a lot of times when people ask me, hey, do you put flaps down outside the final approach fix? And it's kind of a trick question. In most light airplanes, I do not. And my logic is, how often are you out there flying 5-mile finals with 10 degrees of flaps? Like, that's a very unusual situation. Why would you put yourself in an unusual situation when you can't see out the window? Like, why would you not fly the plane in a way you always fly the plane? And a lot of the things you're talking about with the Mooney, this is another buffer that we have that you guys do not have at all. Like in a heavy jet, when you're coming in at 130, 40 knots or whatever you guys approach at, 120 maybe sometimes, or what do you approach at, 130, 40?
Like the 737's fast. So the 737, it's like 149 to 150 something. Yeah, okay. The latitude was like 100 to 110.
Right. Your whole world is more critical. So not only are you not able to arrest descents if they're not stabilized as rapidly and just have to be that much further in front of the airplane, if you don't hit the touchdown zone of the runway, you got a problem, and you've got a short window of time to figure out that that's true. In a light airplane, even a Mooney, some of that is like, we have considered that we have a huge buffer. For example, if the weather is low enough to require us actually flying down to say 200 feet above the ground, Then it's an ILS and we have 5,000 feet of runway in front of us. You have to be pretty off on your speed to blow 5,000 feet or more of runway, even in a Mooney. Like you'd have to be 20 knots fast. or I mean, I don't even know. I do remember one time flying into McCarran in a DA-20 where I had 737s behind me. So I flew the approach at 120, I think, or 130, and then just pulled power to idle over the threshold. And it took me the full length of the runway, which was like 8,000 feet, to actually slow down and land. I don't know if I saved anybody time. But my point is there's a huge buffer. Those are two completely different worlds just before we even really start talking about it, right? Two different worlds. So when it comes to flaps outside the final approach fix, like I said, if I'm in a 172, I do not do that. I fly in at 90 knots in a clean configuration because that's the most familiar and comfortable and normal configuration. And there's no world in which I'm not going to see that runway, be able to go power idle, add my flaps, and land if I need the flaps. That's how I've always done it. That's how I do it. The alternative to that, the quote stabilized version, would be to set the 10 degrees of flaps at the final approach fix, figure out some power settings. So now you're in this somewhat unique configuration that you only use when flying final approach fix inbound, on an instrument approach. And then you'll be able to come down. Now you're still probably going to add more flaps if you see the runway. I mean, I don't know if the assumption is you land with 10, you don't ever change flaps after that, but there are people that are trying to take the heavy transport world and the things that you're saying are really, really important there and bring them down into GA. And my point is just, we have to use caution. Like, sometimes it's not necessary. Now, if it's a high performance plane, a Bonanza, a Mooney, a Cirrus, something like that, I do add flaps outside the final approach fix, just the first notch. So it's not, it may not have rhyme or reason. And I think the only value I could add there is just to have people use caution. The other one really quickly is the 1,000 foot per minute descent, which I feel is completely stabilized in a light aircraft. So my students all can fly 90 knots and 500 feet per minute, or a separate non-precision approach descent of 90 knots and 1,000 feet per minute. But again, in a Cessna, you can arrest 1,000 foot per minute descent just by power into the green, and it's over.
Yeah. This is a comment about putting flaps in well before the final approach fix. I was flying with Josh from Aviation 101. We flew to Garmin headquarters from Dallas. Hopefully the video's out by the time this comes out. But in my mind, I was like thinking, how do I fly this when I fly jet? It's like, all right, well, we're putting flaps out like on downwind, on base, put another notch. We're fully configured, gear, flaps full. And I was like, I forgot how long things take in a 172, if that makes sense. Like, an instrument approach adds another 20, 25 minutes to a flight, which is just what was kind of baffling to me. And I was like, all right, we're still on downwind. We haven't even turned base yet. It's been 8 minutes.
To my world, man.
Like, wow, it takes forever. It's like I wasted a ton of money on my instrument training by just shooting approaches all the time.
Right. God, this is a great dovetail. What you just said is reminded me, because that's how pilots in Europe are taught, and it drives me crazy. So I'll have these guys come over from Switzerland or France or Germany, and they want to fly with me to improve their VFR skills, right? And they think I'm a cowboy because they're all taught to fly 172s, like you just said. It'll be like, and they say it like airline pilots. They'll be like at the beam position. They'll be at flaps 1, and then we go out, 4 miles out and we turn and it's flaps 2 and everything's set. And Richard would have pulled my power to idle and said, you just lost your engine over East Oakland. Where are you going? You know what I mean? So back to that ostrich approach. The real issue in a Cessna is, do I have enough altitude to glide to the runway? Which is a totally different issue than you have when you're out there flying in your 737. You're not worried about where you're going to go if your engine fails. So you're flying these, you're putting flaps in on the downwind or whatever. But it drives me bananas when I fly with European pilots that fly small airplanes that way. I've been saying, where are you going to go if your engine fails? Like, Oakland is back there, like 4 miles now back there. You could have gone power to idle and glided around in a short approach, So that's an example of where a big transport category procedure would be the wrong thing to do in a light airplane.
Yeah, for sure. And I think more Europeans are taught to fly every plane like an airliner, because I think obviously their kind of mold is, at 250 hours, you can go through a cadet program and be flying right seat in a 737. So they're just teaching you to fly an airliner, but just the concepts you start in a 172. Moving on a little bit from that, what do you see are big kind of threats or are big stumping grounds for instrument students?
Well, I think there's a lot of instrument students that never actually learn how to fly instruments. Unfortunately, I think there's a lot of people that get instrument rated that don't feel comfortable flying in the clouds, that don't ever fly in the clouds. I hear stories of double I's, instrument instructors that say they don't feel comfortable flying in clouds. So there's that. You know, I think there's a lot of people that figure I'm going to get my instrument rating, I'm going to get my commercial, I'm going to get my CFI, I'm going to get hired, and I'll fly in the clouds soon enough, but I'm going to do it in an airliner with a captain next to me. And that's like where they get their first IMC, you know, or in their first job.
Yeah.
So that's a real hazard, you know, because I mean, it's not a hazard, I guess, if you're never going to fly instruments in a light airplane. But it would be a hazard if you're a person who wants to fly instruments in a light airplane and you meet that flight instructor. And that's like, you know, and you don't know it. So,
yeah,
and then sorry, go ahead.
I was saying 100% agree. I mean, going straight into flying single pilot IFR is much different than doing simulated instrument and simulated approaches with the foggles. You still have some sort of idea of where you are. Like your body can tell a little bit if you're straight and level, if you're turning, you know, you can still see the ground, right? You can still see out of the small corner of your eye, but IFR, and then you start adding thunderstorms, you start adding icing, and your brain, you're constantly moving and your equilibrium's getting all off. It's like having the actual versus simulated instrument flying is huge, especially if you want to be an airline pilot, and especially if you ever think you'll be flying an approach. You know, it's like you don't want to have your first time flying actual instruments when you actually need it, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, no, 100%. And I think, you know, like if people wanted to see, just check out what we put in the flight side of our instrument course. I think really what we want to emulate is, like we said earlier, single pilot professional operators. That's who, if we in GA, if we want to aspire to be anybody, it's those amazing short haul cargo pilots where they've got one pilot in the plane. You don't ever hear about them because they never get in accidents, but they're up at 4 a.m, right? And they're out, you know, right. Like the procedures that they use, if I had to give something to the instrument folks that are going through it right now, I think take that template idea is really the most valuable thing I can add. Get your instructor to stop forcing you to shoot pool while the balls are still moving. You know, like settle it all down by repeating the same flight, going out and, like you said, Justin, you know, slowly walking into the skills, but then go back to the same thing you've seen so that you can actually measure, did the work you did on the skills, did it really do anything? I think that's a big thing. And then seeking out IMC, like even vacations. I've always thought about doing, you know how we run those airplane camp trips? That's where we started the call. I always thought a great one would be like living the life of a freight dog for a weekend. You know, come to California in August and we'll get up at 4 a.m. and we'll just be IMC all day on the coast. You know, we'll go from like Santa Barbara to Eureka and just fly approach after approach.
Don't invite me to that aviation camp. I don't want to come to that one.
You don't?
I've already done that. I don't need to do that again. I want the one
you were afraid
I want the one where we're going to Napa, you know, we're stopping at wine. You know, I want the fun part, which fun might not be the right term because you would think that was fun because you haven't done that before, but I have done that enough. I'm good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I get to do it all the time, and maybe not at 4 a.m. But you know, lesson signs of 0600. But I just happen to think, I think my point is, I think that here where I live, and I'm up in the mountains now, but the Bay Area is right there, and it's some of the best instrument training in the world, really. There are probably parts of like Israel, Lebanon, Turkey that get the same effect off the east side of the Mediterranean, maybe parts of Spain, but like there aren't that many places that get this deep, thick advection fog. And it's, you know, bases at sometimes 200 feet and a quarter mile viz, tops at 5,000 feet, no wind, no ice, no thunderstorms, no nothing, just a blanket of fog.
Yeah.
And, you know, you can go experience that and get your ticket wet and make it a vacation, you know, come out, stay for a weekend. And I'm not the only guy either. I mean, I think honestly, if anybody who's listening to this is interested in doing that, just call any of the flight schools in Palo Alto or San Carlos and, just
get
make it an IFR vacation. Yeah. All those instructors are comfortable with it. You have to be, or you can't teach there.
Yeah. And then you have complex airspace to throw into that with San Francisco, with Oakland, with all the deltas in the area. So yeah, it's definitely a little bit interesting out there. That's for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's good for that. It's not good for, understanding other weather. So I always like worry about my students when they tell me they're going back to fly in Virginia or something in the summer. I'm like, okay, let's talk again about thunderstorms just one more time.
There's a
you know,
difference between shooting a minimum to an approach to minimums in fog that's relatively smooth and calm than thunderstorms with downdrafts and updrafts and crosswinds, right?
Oh yeah, it's like, no, you get spoiled. I call it a playground. I mean, and not to say that you can't get in trouble. You can. But as far as IFR goes, it's benign. It's what we would call light IFR. You know, it's you know, even I suppose even IFR if it's light. At minimums, it's like, you know, I don't know.
Yeah,
it's not hard IFR for sure.
That's good to know. Yeah,
but it's incredible practice. Just the ability to fly the approach all the way to minimums and then execute the mist and still be in the soup. And
yeah, and I'm guessing icing is not necessarily something you have to worry about constantly where you are. Now, the higher you go, obviously, but I mean, in the wintertime in North Carolina, I remember when I was doing my training, it was about 3,000 feet was where the icing level seemed to live, 3,000 to 4,000 feet. So you could sneak a flight in there. If it went higher, you're good. When I did my private pilot training, it seemed like the freezing level was always on the ground in Ohio. So it was much different up in Ohio than it was in North Carolina. It gave you the ability to fly more hard IFR.
Yeah. And, you know, that's, to be fair, a world I don't know a whole lot about. I mean, I know that I get away with a lot. So in terms of my own personal minimums, I don't fly IFR when the freezing levels are at or below the MEA. But partially that's because I fly in California. You know, I mean, I know, I think I said that to Flight Chops once, and he's like, well, yeah, but I'm in Toronto, so I'm going to call a different instructor. You know, I mean, like there are folks that understand the way ice works in those really cold temperatures. You might be one of them. It's a world that I don't have to deal with, at least not yet. And so I just make my minimums easy, and I fly tons of IFR primarily because of where I live. You know?
Yeah. Icing sucks, man. Stay away from it if you can. So just stay where you are. Yeah.
Yeah. Once I think it was Mac McClellan from Flying Magazine. He used to write or maybe he still writes the business column. I don't know. Anyway, he once said that he thought Fiki was just silly for any airplane. Like he thought no airplane, zero. And he flew Gulfstreams and all sorts of things. He said, like, no airplane should be approved for flight into known icing. He said, I don't care what airplane I'm in. When I start to ice up, I look for a way to get out, you know? So.
Yeah, that's cute. Anyway. I mean, you got to go in and lay it. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, this is different than talking a 172 or whatever it is. But, you know, a lot of these routes, you're going up to Buffalo and people want to get in and the plane's capable of knocking off ice. So why aren't you going to go? You know, it's kind of. Obviously there's levels to it. If it's too bad, you don't go, you go around, you go somewhere else. So there's definitely a safety factor there. But I mean, you're picking up some ice and planes, like you said, Fiki, flying in an icing. It's good to go. You got a hot wing for a reason.
No, it's true. And in an airliner, hey, that's a whole different animal.
Yeah.
Like, by the way, when I say I don't fly in freezing levels at or below the MEAs, that's in aircraft without de-icing equipment.
Yeah.
If I have de-icing equipment, that minimum is not.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, we have to use caution in a plane like a Cirrus, for example, which is technically Fiki, but you can get into trouble pretty fast. Yeah.
One of the last questions I'll ask, we can don't want to keep you too long with this. I don't want it to be like a 2-hour episode, but when you talk about going to the IFR check ride, talk about, obviously we had the written knocked out. We talked about that. It's important to knock the written out early on. Use the ground school app, use whatever you need to do to get it done. Mock oral check rides, everything is in there. But talk about, I guess I'll say it this way. My very first check ride, I was not prepared for IFR. I actually failed my IFR check ride. I didn't prepare well enough. I just trusted my CFI. I was kind of like, all right, let's go. And I was like, all right, cool, let's go. And then I got there and it was just like a disaster. Didn't feel ready for the check ride, just took it anyways. But how do you go into the IFR check ride? Do you think it's easier knowing that you know how check rides work from the PPL check ride? Do you think it's just a whole different beast because it's like a different language?
It's kind of a whole different beast, you know. The mistakes, like at the end of the day, that I see a lot of pilots make, silly things like not like they get rushed, or they'll be flying around with HSIs that aren't tuned to any nav signal.
Yeah.
They enter a hold maybe the wrong way, just like they get tired. So like I do a bit of coaching with instrument students going into the check ride. I always tell them to bring a Snickers. It's a long check ride, or bring some like blood sugar boost, whatever, you know, picks you up a little bit, like a
some
soda
pilot's coffee.
Yeah, like iced coffee or soda or something like that. Because there's going to come a point where you're tired. The main thing that will save your life under IFR is the ability to slow the airplane down, to recognize, on the check ride, to recognize when you're getting pushed. One of the tricks that I always do to my students, and I know there are examiners out there that do it, when things are going well, we'll fly an approach, we'll miss the approach, and I'll say, I know they're not ready. Like, I know they're not ready. They haven't even quite got to the missed approach hold yet or something like that. And I'll say, okay, you ready for the next one? Like to just like nudge them along and see if they go, yeah, I'm ready for the next one or whatever. What they really need to say to me is, no, like, stand by, I need a second. Like, once they're able to say that to me and to air traffic control and understand they need to kind of slow down and create space for themselves, I feel a whole lot better about the check ride. Mm-hmm. That ability to sort of recognize when that's happening, create the space you need to stay in front of the airplane. When the examiner sees that, there's going to be something that flips in their brain. They're looking for that. They want to see that, that you can handle that.
Yeah, they want to see how you handle adversity. Every instrument check ride is going to come to a point where they're going to push you, any good examiner at least, they're going to push you to the point where they want to see how you handle it, and they want to see if you overcome it, and if you just breeze right through it. And if you don't breeze right through it, they want to see how you react, right? They want to see if you slow the airplane down, if you take a little bit of time, if you ask for vectors off the approach to kind of go hold and figure it out, do it again. Those are all good answers. The bad answer is just blowing down the ILS, just happy, dumb, and just smiling and having no idea what's going on. If you find yourself in a check ride and you think it's too easy, it's probably because you're missing something.
Right. Yeah, 100%. And for CFIs who are listening to this, the way I would walk into what I just said to test your student is, you have to do 3 approaches. So after the second approach, before you think your student is fully ready, like they haven't briefed that approach yet, would be a great indicator. They haven't pulled out the plate and briefed it yet. Just say to them, when able, tell air traffic control you'd like the localizer runway 3 at Hayward next, or whatever. Air traffic control will do all the work after that. If your student keys the mic and says to air traffic control, hey, we want the whatever approach it is next, air traffic control immediately is going to say, okay, I advise when you have the ATIS, turn left heading 030. Let me know when you have the 1 minute weather. Whatever they start saying to you, they're going to take you off the task you were on. Now, your students should recognize this as a, holy cow, my instructor, I just called this person, I'm overwhelmed. The instructor introduced this. Your student should say, like, either tell you, no, I'm not going to call them right now, or when ATC comes back, say, actually, I'm not ready for that approach yet. I'd like some delay vectors while I get, prepared. ATC would be fine with that. They'd go, okay, Roger, turn left, whatever, 090, I'll give you some delay vectors. If your instructor or examiner saw you do that, like a big box is checked. Okay, this guy did not get pushed into rushing, did not get pushed into something he couldn't do.
For sure.
That's key. So yeah, and then scientific method. So like one of the things that people will see in the app is whenever I talk about flying, it's like everything's a hypothesis until we can prove it's true. So like a holding pattern, for example, if you think it's going to be a parallel entry, prove it. And there's this little methods we can do to prove that you have the right entry. And then you can talk in front of the airplane. If you can verify, if you can guess at it, prove it, and then say, okay, when I get to that fix, here's the 5 things I'm going to do. You're kind of bulletproof.
Yeah. One thing I'll say, I'm so thankful for flying more advanced FMSs. When I was doing my instrument training, I was on a standard 6-pack with maybe a 430. But having, G1000s now, having the Garmin G5000 that I flew at NetJets and the Latitude, having the plane know exactly how to enter hold, it's life-changing, right? Like, obviously, you need to know what comes next as well and be prepared if that doesn't work. But, learning how to do holds is pretty hard for me. I had to, take myself out of the airplane, think about where I was. Some people are doing this to everything. It's like just learning how to do that can be kind of difficult. Once you get it, it's like, wow, why did I ever struggle with that? But I actually think I watched one of your videos when I was 21 trying to figure out how to do holds. So nice.
I think we have a great system. First you visualize it on your HSI and then you use your thumb to check it. Yeah, it's funny. My on my instrument check ride, it was going fantastically well. And the guy that I was with was an old Corsair instructor, legend, Lou Fields. He was 89 years old or something like that, I think, when I was doing my check ride. I'm very lucky to have known him at all. Yeah. And it was a tough check ride, man. It was tough. The oral was tough. Everything was tough. Everything about Lou was tough just by nature. He's just like one of these old Army guys, Navy guys, really. But he must have thought I was doing a good job. He must have wanted me to pass, because when it came time to enter holds, I was about to turn the wrong way. Like we got to the fix and I was about to turn the wrong way. I can say this now because Lou's not alive anymore. And I went to turn and the yoke wouldn't turn. Like it just wouldn't go the way I wanted it to go. And I look over at Lou and I could see his finger, his thumb and his index finger just holding it down. He didn't look at me. He just looked straight ahead. But he blocked me from turning the wrong way. Saved my butt on the check ride. And
that's awesome. Rating, so. Shout out to him.
Yeah, shout out to Lou.
Yeah. Well, I mean, some examiners know, you know, like they're like, all right, this dude's got it. Like this is clearly like a fatigue mistake or something like that. And I mean, there are some that won't let any mistakes go. You know, they're like, "Oh, sorry, dude, you're failed." But there are definitely some out there that are like, I got you, dude.
I know. Like, this was older. This was. I don't know if that would fly today. I mean, this was what was my instrument rating? 1999, 2000, maybe. So
yeah,
well, anyway, kind of a different world.
Definitely a different world. But Jason, I appreciate you coming on as always. I appreciate just talking to you. And like I said, we just literally just start talking and feel like we just, we'll leave it in, like I said, but it's just talking great information. So I appreciate you coming on. We'll complete the series eventually, but we'll do Commercial Pilot next whenever we have the chance. I know our schedules.
I can't wait for that one, honestly. Let's go. Thank you. Thank you, Justin. I appreciate being here. So thanks for having me. It's always good talking.
Anytime. If we want the Ground School app, tell them where to go and how to get it.
Well, I mean, learnthefinerpoints.com is a place you can go. I think your viewers have a code, right? They can get 10% off or something like that. And,
I'll put that down below as well.
Yeah, I think it's like, anyway, yeah, if it's in the description, or email us to get that discount. But Learn the Finer Points or the App Store.
Check. Yeah. Learn the Finer Points of the App Store and use code Justin, which I'm pretty sure it is. Or Pilot. We'll find out. Yeah. But look at the description. I'm sure you can find it the best. Yeah, I should look at that before I said that. But you know, it is what it is.
It's all right. Yeah, I think it's Justin, if I remember.
Yeah. Let's go with that.
All right.
But yeah, man, I appreciate your time and I appreciate your knowledge. It's just a lot of fun talking to you at all times. And if everyone wants any other questions, we can always do a part 2. So send a question either to me. My email is justin@pilothq.com, or reach out to Jason. And I'm sure you guys know how to reach out to him. So thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you later.
Okay. Awesome, Justin. Thanks.